we can never be gods after all. But we can become something less than human with frightening ease. N.K. Jemisin. Bending Not Breaking, the Dragon Prince Edition. Book 2, Episode 7, Fire and Fury. Alright everybody, welcome back to Bending Not Breaking. This is your host Ben Pruitt, and I am so excited because we just had 2 episodes with Jason Simpson, and how lucky are we to have been given such an opportunity. I'm really in awe because I'm not sure that I would ever have been able to learn from him or any of our other guests without listeners like you all for making it happen. So thank you for supporting the show, for telling your friends about us, for sharing it on social media, reviewing it on all the various platforms, and for those of you who do so, thank you for supporting us financially on Patreon. Like, you make all the work behind the scenes worth it. So thank you so much for being a part of this project. I want to go ahead and dive into the episode, though. So today we're talking about heroism, and while today's episode is all about heroism, I think it's important to unpack that term a bit, since there's really just so much baggage wrapped up in what heroism means, in all of the different various connotations it has. And if you search for a definition, you'll notice that there's a lot of differences among the various resources. And furthermore, there are a lot of articles and stories, and there's just so many different things that claim to know that this is what heroism is. And one article I found really compelling referenced the banality of evil. And I think I want to start there in order to kind of put some context around heroism. And the banality of evil is, just to put it simply, the ease with which humanity, us, the way that we can fall into acts of evil. And among the various examples cited in this article was just the infamous Stanford prison experiment from the 60s. And just to give you a brief recap, I remember learning about this in my psychology class in high school. But essentially it was 24 young men who responded to a newspaper ad that had called for participants to be part of a study, and they were randomly assigned roles as either prisoners or guards in this simulated jail at Stanford University's psychology department. So the prisoners were, it was very realistic. They were arrested at their homes by real police officers. They were booked. They were brought to the jail. Everything from the deliberately humiliating prison uniforms to the cell numbers on the lab doors. There were mandatory strip searches. There were delousing. Everything was designed to replicate the depersonalization experience of being in a real prison, which speaks to the problems of, prison and, cops. But let's pause on that conversation. Anyway, the men who were assigned to be guards were given khaki uniforms, mirrored glasses, and they were also given billy clubs. And the idea was to study the psychology of imprisonment, to see what happens when you put, theoretically good people in a dehumanizing place. And here's the deal. Within a matter of hours, what had been intended as a controlled experiment in human behavior really just became very disturbing. Essentially, there was a prison rebellion on the second day of the experiment. Guards began to use increasingly degrading forms of punishment, and the prisoners became more and more passive, and each group rapidly took on these behaviors associated with their role, their label, and not because of any particular internal predisposition or or from instructions from the experimenters, but rather because the situation itself so powerfully called for the two groups to assume those identities that they took on. And so, honestly, it was really problematic. It was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it was ended abruptly after 6 days because there was so much inhumane treatment. So eventually an outside voice reminded them and stepped in and reminded them of their ethical responsibilities. And so I want to lift that up just because this is just one example of how susceptible humanity is to falling into really just unthinkable, malicious acts. And I think it's important to realize and note that there were some guards who were not committing abuse. And the problem with that is not committing abuse in this situation, I think, is not enough. There was no speaking up on the prisoner's behalf. And this is perhaps the nature of evil, or perhaps an aspect of it then, the experience of seeing abuse, seeing some wrongdoing and not confronting it or condemning it. And so my one of the one-liners I learned from my supervisor a while ago was, if we do not condemn it, we condone it. And so there was no confrontation. There was no approach from these, quote, good guards that could have condemned this behavior and held some accountability. Instead, it just kind of was left to continue. And so I wonder if then we could consider heroism the act of condemning evil, right? Speaking up and confronting problematic behavior, which, like, in a way makes heroism as banal as evil, right? If we all have the capacity for heroism, just as we have this capacity for evil. And, you know, it seems across the data from all the various resources I checked out, including one of the main sources of the Heroic Imagination Project, which is a organization that is researching heroism in everyday activity and people. And heroism theoretically includes 4 main aspects. The first is a quest, which is essentially the goal of any sort of thing, which is the preservation of an ideal or the preservation of life, for example. An anticipated sacrifice or risk is the second component. So any sort of sacrifice or risk, whether that be physical or social or mental, any sort of sacrifice or risk that is anticipated and known going into it. It has the capacity for active or passive acts, which means it can be something that you do, like you run into battle, if you will, is a pretty common connotation of heroism. But also it can be not an action, but it can be passive as well. And then finally, the fourth component is that it can be a one-time deal or it can persist over time. And I think with all of these things in mind, I'm really interested to kind of parse out, where is heroism? Where do these 4 components pop up? And how do we see the, quote, banality of heroism in this episode? What are these small acts of heroism that we can parse out and identify and label that way? So I hope you'll keep on joining me as we dive into the main bulk of the episode. But before we do that, it is important that we play by the rules, and I'm going to be heroic here, and at great personal sacrifice, I am going to commit to my quest of preserving the intention of the podcast by doing a 30-second recap. And this is an active act, and it is a one-time deal, every episode. But it is what it is. So, the recap, here we go. On my mark. Get set. Here I go. Okay, so Callum is playing with the magic cube, and then he chats with Rayla, and then they discuss the Moonstone Path. One does not simply walk into Zadia. And then Soren's on a power trip, and then it turns out this dragon is flying around the town, and he takes command to fight it even though it's not attacking. And then the dragon proceeds to burn down the town, and then Claudia uses dark magic to shoot the dragon, and then the dragon finds the downed dragon, and then Ezrin connects with it. And Viren and Opelli square off about his treason, and then Soren and Claude's chain dragon down, and the dragon return to save it. And then Callum does dark magic to unleash the dragon, and Soren fights it, and then Snack, Crackle, Pop. Soren can't move. Viren completes dagger ritual with Erebos, and then Caterpillar up the arm. Yuck, deep voice. Okay. Yikes. That was potentially a callous joke of snap, crackle, pop, but yikes. Forgive me. Here we are talking about some pretty intense stuff that happens in this episode. So here we go. Let's dive in. This is our top 5 moments of heroism, or lack of, but top 5 moments to talk about regarding heroism. And so I'm curious if some of these were the same ones that you thought of after hearing the lens. So the first one, I want to just, go to the main thing that I thought of when I was thinking about choosing a lens here, which is this slaying the dragon narrative that Soren is kind of a part of here. And I remember growing up with these old stories of these heroes and knights who, in fantasy stories, slew dragons to demonstrate their heroism, and if they slew the dragon, they got to marry the princess, and, all the patriarchal narratives there. And so I'm curious about this moment, about this whole episode here, because Soren, the townspeople have said this dragon has been around for 3 days, it hasn't attacked, and Soren comes in and says, hey, I'm a member of the Crown Guard, we're going to take this dragon down. And they're like, but it hasn't attacked us. And Soren says, it doesn't matter, it's the enemy. And I'm curious, if we put this in the context of heroism, then what is the quest here for Soren? What is the quest? And what is he trying to protect? Is it that he's trying to protect the town, or is that he sees the glory of slaying this dragon? Because, Claudia later in the episode does talk about how it's one of Soren's life goals to slay a dragon. So I'm curious if that narrative of this is what it means to be a hero for a knight, for someone in Soren's position, and I wonder how much of a factor that played in him, feeling the need to take down this dragon. Because, is this a moment of heroism? What's this quest? What's the goal here, right? I don't know what it is. Is it... Because I guess if I were to parse out what it could be and assume the best here, it's that he believes he's doing the town a favor by slaying the dragon, and I don't think he... Maybe it's that he's not weighing the risks, or he didn't realize the risk, or maybe he overestimated his ability to take down the dragon. There's a lot of factors. It could be all of those things, but I just find it really interesting to dissect this moment where Soren has made this decision and it has dire consequences. So I'm just interested in parsing that out. I'm curious what you all think. Is this an act of heroism? And if so, can you help me understand why you think so? And I'd love to hear about it. You can send us a voicemail at thearkofe@gmail.com, and that's ark as in ARK. The Ark of E. So that leads me to my second point, which is very connected to that, but it's this: when Soren releases Corvus, what I see there is a real, true act of heroism that I label that as an act of heroism, because Soren demonstrates his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes. And for real, it's a big mistake, and it has, again, really rough consequences. But his capacity to admit his mistake here is so important. And furthermore, he humbles himself and says, Claudia, I think I really messed up here. And Claudia helps him, right? And then in this moment where literally everything is on fire, Claudia chooses to take him down a peg. And I think that the way that she says, well, you have to say this and I'll save your butt. And he does, he says it. And that kind of humbling himself to say, I messed up, let me actually live into, I'll say what you want me to say, my pride doesn't matter right now. I think that's a skill, because there are a lot of people who would have doubled down and become even more toxically masculine. I don't know. That could be the term. There could also be a lot of other things that this potentially would fall into, but there's just so much there when he releases Corvus, says, hey, you have the capacity to protect these people. I have the capacity to let you go. And then he does. And I think that is really illustrative of Soren's true nature. And I think that's a really important and integral piece. So I wanted to lift that up as something to think about. Okay, my next one is that, Callum and Rayla get into this conversation around like someone needing to take a stand when no one else will in order to break the cycle of violence. And like it was a little convoluted, like Rayla quoting Callum, quoting Rayla. It's like there's a lot of like little quotes there, but this idea that Rayla feels the need, like she goes in to save this dragon and she says, "Well, live or die, this dragon's going home." And I think in my mind that by definition kind of fits this concept of heroism, right? She has this quest, which is to preserve the life of this dragon. She understands that she might die in this sacrifice, right? It is an active act that she is taking on, and this is something that can happen in this one time, but seems to be a recurring theme for Rayla. So this to me by definition seems like a moment of Rayla acting and taking on this banal heroism that we all have access to. And so I just wanted to lift that moment up. And connected to that is my next one, my fourth point, which is Callum. So this is a little bit more complicated, I think. Callum talks about how frustrated he is that he does not have the skills and abilities to make a difference. Like he wants to go and help, but he doesn't believe that he has the capacity to do so. And so I'm curious about that, because does having skills and abilities make it easier to be heroic? And if not the skill and ability itself, does our competence, does our knowledge of, our awareness of our abilities and skills allow us more access to our capacity for heroism? In which case, I wonder if we would be more heroic if we knew what was within our power and what was not, right? Because he knows it's not in his ability to make a difference, and so, but he ends up making a difference, right? Heroism has this like relatedness to advantage, to skill, to privilege. But conversely, when he's earlier in the episode says, "Hey, we gotta retreat. We can't do anything more right now," is that not also an act of heroism, where his, again, knowledge and understanding of their capacity allow him to make what some might call a cowardly act to retreat? But I wonder if rather it can be seen as an act of heroism to say, I'm saving these 3-4 lives by retreating at this moment. And so in a way, I wonder if heroism is a matter of perspective. And that kind of brings me to my last point, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this. So does Callum using dark magic count as an act of heroism? And I'm curious because I think there's a lot of people that might differ on the response here, but in a way, it again fits this definition, right? There's a quest. He wants to protect the dragon, protect Rayla. He wants to make sure that they can continue taking Zim to Zadia. He has personal sacrifice where he is doing something against his morals and values. He is, taking on this act. And so I'm curious about this. And yet, is doing something not so good in order to do something good an ethical way to be a hero? And I think that's the question. The ethics of heroism, if you will. And I'm just curious about that. Like, where is the ethical line in terms of the deciding what is the greater good? Is doing this potentially bad thing in order to do a much greater positive thing worth it? And there's a lot of people who disagree in terms of that kind of ethical quandary. So I'm curious about your thoughts. And again, like, does that make it so that it's easier to empathize with Claudia and Viren's use of dark magic in order to achieve these bigger ends, the means to using a dark magic means to get to a quote positive end? And so I'm curious if intent matters. I'm curious if means matter when it comes to being labeled as a hero, which kind of leads me to a point of, like, is heroism something that you claim, or is it something that is bestowed upon you? Can I say, I am a hero, I am a hero, I did this? Or is it something that you have to be given the title of hero, and people have to see you that way? I don't want to phrase that in the form of a binary. I think it can be both, but I'm curious what y'all's thoughts are on whether that's a claimable thing or if it's something that is given to us. Because I wonder if, for instance, Viren sees himself as doing the heroic thing. If, I wonder if by committing this, magical ritual that allows Erebos to come through the mirror as this caterpillar guy, I wonder if that's an act of heroism in his eyes, in a way, because he's doing the only thing he knows what to do. He knows how to do in order to do what he can for Catullus. Ooh, man, what a big episode. There's so much in this, and we didn't talk about several things, but man, I am very intrigued by this concept now. I'm going to be thinking about it for a while. So if this triggers some things for you to think about, and you're interested in sending us a voicemail to tell us about it, feel free to record a voice memo on your phone and email it to thearkofe@gmail.com, or you can also tweet at us your thoughts, or Instagram or Facebook. We have an open Facebook group for listeners to the podcast, and all of that can be found at BNB for Bending Not Breaking _pod. Again, that's BNB _pod. Okay, we're going to take a short musical interlude, and then we will be right back for our Lens MVP and our gratitude. Everybody, welcome back to Bending Not Breaking. I'm sure that musical interlude was nice for you, and it was nice for me. I enjoyed that musical interlude. But let's move on. Let's take on this next segment of the Lens MVP, most valuable player in terms of the Lens today, which, again, to remind everyone, is heroism. So, with this in mind, I would love to nominate Rayla for the title of Lens MVP this episode because, for reasons I've already described, I think that Rayla consistently throughout the series takes on these quests to do what is right, and then does so at personal risk, right? I think that it was an act of heroism in episode 1 where she passively chases down this guard, which is an active act, but then she passively lets that guard go. And she does it at personal sacrifice, she loses and knows that if she were to tell her comrades that if she didn't do that she would be in great trouble, if not, physical trouble. And so I think that in and of itself can be seen as an act of heroism. And I'm referencing a completely different episode for this, but I think that that's just to kind of show that she's been making heroic deeds and doing heroic deeds the whole time. And I think that this episode highlights just a continuation of that behavior. And so I think that Rayla is a pretty spectacular hero, and she's my nomination. If you would like to nominate someone, feel free to nominate someone on any of our social medias. We'd love to hear about it. Send us a voicemail, and we'll play it, and we'd love to get your feedback. So remember, follow us on all of those things, BNB_pod. Okay, this brings us to our final segment, which is gratitude, in which we share a moment from the episode that a character has given us to be grateful for. And this episode, I am just so grateful for Claudia. And I'm specifically grateful for her in this moment at the end where she sees Ezrin and Zim, and she goes all dark magic mode and ready to take this dragon, ready to take Zim, but Soren calls out for her and she listens. And when Claudia chooses Soren over Zim, I just melt a little bit, because, you know, it's just animated so well and you see the pain on Soren's face, and I think it's really beautiful that she chose family here over this task that she has to do, and so I'm grateful for that. Okay, that brings us to the end of this episode, and FYI, we have another very special guest next week, so you won't want to miss it. But until then, remember, you can follow us on all the social medias. You can find us on Patreon at the same handle, BNB_pod. Big thank you to all of our listeners, all of our patrons. Big thank you to the Ark of E, Alex Mayfield, Noah Blanchard, Max Gongaware. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and until next time, be well and do good.